Welcome to today's webinar for the U.S. Asia Institute entitled Exploring U.S.-China Dynamics in Academia. For those of you who have attended our events before, welcome back. And for those new to the U.S. Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Megan Corey, and I'm a program assistant at USAI. For background, the U.S. Asia Institute is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 45-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. All attendees should be aware that today's event will be on the record, recorded, and uploaded to the USAI YouTube channel. We ask that you please remain muted and keep your camera turned off throughout the speaker presentations. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to type it in the chat box or wait to say your question during the Q&A session at the end.
Now, moving on to today's program, I would like to introduce our speakers for this briefing, Michael Beckley and Eileen Chow. Michael Beckley holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University, a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Previously, Dr. Beckley was an International Security Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and worked for the U.S. Department of Defense, the RAND Corporation, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He continues to advise offices within the U.S. intelligence community and U.S. Department of Defense. Eileen Chow received her AB in Literature from Harvard and her PhD in Comparative Literature from Stanford. She is Associate Professor of the Practice of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University, the Director of Graduate Studies for the East Asian Studies Graduate Program, and a founding faculty member of Asian American and Diaspora Studies, as well as the Story Lab at Duke. Dr. Chow is Director of the Cheng Shih-Wo Institute of Chinese Journalism at Shi Sin University, and she co-directs the Biographical Literature Press. She also serves on the executive board of the LA Review of Books.
We are very fortunate to have both of these speakers with us today. We often hear about the relationship between the U.S. and China in a diplomatic or strategic setting, but less often discussed is how U.S.-China relationships affect the world of academia and the exchange of ideas. This webinar will address key areas of interest concerning how U.S.-China relations affect or manifest in the academic sphere. Some of the questions we will consider today are: what challenges do scholars face when engaging in cross-cultural research, and how do they navigate them? On the flip side, what benefits might they gain? And how do U.S.-China dynamics in academia reflect the broader, complex relationship between the two countries and their governments? So without further ado, I will pass it to Dr. Beckley to begin today's session. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Brenda, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm really happy to be here with you all today to talk about some of the challenges and as well as some of the opportunities that come with studying China. As Brenda and Megan mentioned, I mostly focus on foreign policy issues, and it's not surprising, I'm sure, to hear that U.S.-China relations have always been pretty complex and multifaceted, but I think especially today it presents some acute challenges that are really forcing a lot of us in the field to basically reshape how we conduct research. And the most pressing and obvious issue is just simply access to China. I think especially over the last few years, certainly since COVID, but even starting in the late 2010s, the Chinese government was really tightening its grip on information flows. You've probably seen news articles about the censorship of, say, negative economic news or a host of other sensitive topics that even Chinese academics are not supposed to be discussing openly, let alone foreigners coming in and mucking around. And just access to China in general for those of us studying sensitive issues has really tightened, and not just for scholars like myself, but for journalists, policy analysts, other researchers. And this is a big change, I think, than over the last few decades. So when I was in graduate school in the 2000s and 2010s, my advisor is this guy, Andrew Nathan, who has been long banned from entering the PRC and couldn't get a visa because he brought forth the so-called Tiananmen papers that kind of gave us an inside look at the decision-making that the regime used when they ultimately decided to send tanks into the streets and mow down a bunch of students. So he was banned, but for most of us, that wasn't really an issue. But I think what's really changed in the last few issues is even if you're not doing something nearly that sensitive, the scrutiny, the delays, and sometimes just the outright rejections for visa applications. I mean, if you do anything on human rights or Xinjiang or Taiwan, and even increasingly just broader geopolitical issues, it's getting really hard unless you're part of some kind of delegation that it seems like the CCP wants to bring in. So, for example, they just had a meeting where they brought in people like Graham Allison from Harvard and a bunch of business leaders from top American companies. But that, I mean, a lot of that is just, those are people that have been saying nice things about China recently. And so it's no surprise that the regime brought them in. But if you're critical and if your research, like mine, for example, has been called out explicitly in state media, then it's just becomes very difficult. So you have this logistical hurdle that really makes it hard to conduct on the ground research, to gather firsthand insights. It's even become harder for me in particular to engage with local scholars just because they themselves are subject to increasing censorship. And so in addition to just the visa issue, I would just say the environment in China has become much more restricted. So even when you get access, there's constraints on what can be studied. I feel much more of the surveillance state in China, certainly than when I was a graduate student in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And you've really, I think the biggest problem is you've actually seen a lot of the most talented and experienced journalists essentially have to leave the country. And so the vast majority of them are in Taiwan or South Korea, somewhere in Japan. So they're reporting on China from outside of the mainland. And that obviously comes with a big trade-off of just being one step removed from the source. So I wish I had a more positive message. Now, there are some, I guess, silver linings. I wouldn't call them necessarily opportunities, but one thing is that exodus of top reporters and researchers to other parts of Asia has actually in some ways created these vibrant new hubs for studying China, because you have this concentration of very knowledgeable people that are suddenly in a liberal democratic environment, and they can easily speak their mind and easily transfer stuff over the internet that's not censored in the way that it was before. And so they are now continuing to provide this crucial vantage point for observing China, especially as it pertains to cross-strait relations or Chinese foreign policy with South Korea, with Japan. And then I've also seen some interesting interdisciplinary approaches start to bubble up. So I think people have been sort of forced to get more creative as they've lost access to both China as well as their interlocutors in China. And so that's just created this increasing need to collaborate with experts in other fields to gain whatever kind of research leverage you can on an issue. So you're seeing political scientists teaming up with tech folks or economists or people doing environmental studies. And I think in some ways that's building a more comprehensive picture of China's global role. And it just means that for you, you young people who are going to be studying Asia going forward, it just means you should expect, but also look forward to engaging with a wider array of disciplines and methodologies than before, because the constraints have forced this sort of creative efflorescence as I've seen it. The last thing is what I've really shifted to in recent years, and I should say I'm really more of an international relations scholar that studies China rather than a China scholar per se. I mean, I very much look at China from a geopolitical lens and very much from a US foreign policy lens. So take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt there. But one way I've found to be very useful to supplement the sources I can gain from China is to study contemporary Chinese foreign policy by comparing it to that of past great powers that have been put in similar situations to what China currently is. So my first book and set of research coming out of grad school was all about why great powers rise and fall over time. And what I eventually found just from studying a whole host of past great powers was that no country that has experienced China's demographic profile with its rapid aging, no country that has racked up debt as fast as China has or employed this investment-driven economic model none of those countries ever avoided eventually having a lost decade of essentially 0% economic growth going to the future. And I remember in the early 2010s when China's economy was booming, and I was arguing that actually this China's rise was going to peter out and that its economy was going to be racking up unsustainable debt. A lot of people thought that that was crazy, but I think if you look at the history of other countries, you can gain some insights. And I think China's current economic troubles speak a lot to those things. And I think it's just a lot of this involves pushing back on what I still see as a prevalent myth of Chinese exceptionalism. So I still see both Western and non-Western scholars sort of arguing that the laws of history or economic gravity somehow don't apply to China. So, for example, I just actually debated this Chinese scholar. She's at the London School of Economics, but she's from Beijing. Her name's Ke Jin, and she just wrote a book called The New China Playbook, where she basically argues that a lot of the Western models of economic development don't apply to China, and therefore we shouldn't expect similar outcomes for its economy. I very much disagree with that view, and I think when you look at just the full gamut of other great powers, you can actually gain some insight into what China is going through. So I did that on the economics, and then more recently, I've been studying what I've called peaking powers. So these are great powers that have been rising very rapidly over several decades, and then their economy starts to slow down, and their rivals start to gang up on them. And so a lot of my research is basically ask the question, what happens when a formerly rising power starts to approach the potential end of its rise? And I feel like I've gained a lot of insights just studying the history of past. There's been many rising powers in the past, and we can actually learn quite a bit about China today from studying those examples in the past. So that's just one way to kind of get around the difficulties. There's surely many others and probably better ways, but that I found that to be very helpful. So, I think the most important thing I would just say to you all is just the importance of resilience and adaptability. In this field, things change very rapidly. I mean, the landscape of US-China relations has really shifted dramatically over the last 15 years, which is basically the time that I've been studying it intensively, and I expect it to change dramatically over the next 15 years. And so it's really just being comfortable with that fluid nature of the subject and being willing to just kind of roll with it and do what you can. And I still think there's still so much low-hanging fruit because it's such a big, important, complex topic that even under constrained information environments, there's still plenty to say and plenty to research and find out. So on that happy note, I'll turn things over to Eileen, but thank you so much for having me here.
So maybe I should just jump right in. I want to say thank you to Megan and to Brenda for hosting this and for inviting us. I think it's wonderful for undergrads, for your generation to take on these questions because as Professor Beckley Michael said, these are questions going forward and we can't predict what happens in the next 10, 15 years, the way that we can't predict how things have changed in the last 10, 15, right? So a couple things. Maybe I guess after hearing Michael's slightly starker conversation, I will do the glass half full, but a couple different things. So I'm actually currently in Europe, and but even in Europe, two major events following. One is, of course, the Olympics, and it is really interesting to see the Olympics as covered here, right? So as well as, of course, U.S. politics and Tim Walz, both Biden's stepping down from the next election, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. But I'm not talking about U.S. politics today, but one kind of interesting highlight point that a lot of people have mentioned about Tim Walz, the new Democratic VP candidate, which is that he studied abroad in China in 1989 to 1990. He was a young teacher who went on a Harvard student-sponsored program called World Teach. And he was in Foshan and Guangdong from 1989 to 90. And you might imagine that after the Tiananmen massacre of the June 1989, which since I am older than Michael, I will say I very much experienced as an undergrad and and followed, and so it was really interesting time. I also lived in China in the early 1990s, and so it was a very interesting time to enter into the PRC when both internally but also globally people were at kind of the lowest low, right? The way that one imagined US-China relations or imagined China as a regime or Chinese people as being able to function within this authoritarian space, that was an incredibly fraught moment. And but what's interesting about all this coverage of Waltz having spent a year there and later as a teacher leading student tours there, but also as a congressman and the Minnesota governor, is the way that we realize how few US political leaders have actually spent time in China. So George H.W. Bush was China ambassador. So he and potentially, if Waltz becomes vice president, are two of the few people on the executive level in US politics who have actually lived in China. And so that's kind of interesting to think about how if the US-China relations is always situated as a kind of sometimes a zero-sum game, sometimes as oppositional, sometimes a kind of uneasy alliance, that so few US politicians actually have real experience with Chinese people. And J.D. Vance, in one of his quote takes, a lot of people know that he was Amy Tra's protege at Yale, but one of the things he has mentioned recently is the only Chinese American he has ever known is Amy Tra, which seems a little strange given that he's lived in the Bay Area for 4 years and went to Yale Law. But, that's his take, right? And I think, of course, the gesture is to say, I'm not contaminated by suspect China ties. But in both cases, and we're not talking ideology or political viewpoints, it is interesting to think about how people view China as an enemy state. And therefore, the kind of language and conversation about it has to be framed in this way. This is not at all a kind of China apology or PRC regime apology. I should say, for biographical purposes, I grew up in Taiwan. I am from Taiwan, and I came to the US for higher education. Like many, many of my students, right? International students or people who came for high school or college. And they too are also part of the future shaping of US-China relations and academia. One thing I really appreciate Brenda and Megan's framing questions, but I should also point out that the people who go on to shape US-China relations, both within academia and within the administration or within politics, are no longer what we might imagine an earlier model of, not necessarily non-Chinese heritage or Sino-heritage China hands who then see this as an absolute foreign space, but rather a lot of people like me who have family, friends, ties, human relationships, and also conflicted political ideas about what it means to study US-China relations. And so that is just a framework that I want to present to, especially since Megan mentioned earlier that probably a lot of you who are listening are people who are entering the field or starting the field, to think about how our positionality is already very, very different from people who went to China in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and that a lot of people and the people who had access to doing either research or other kinds of work in China, especially during COVID and post-COVID, are frankly people with Chinese heritage. And this was true in Taiwan as well. And so that also changes the calculus of how we think about our relationship. It is not an abroad, right? But this is either kind of renegotiating one's positionality within a complicated nexus of US-China. So I did want to put that out there and say, and even for me, so Taiwan is not a single-minded opposition to China. Politically, yes, I would say, right? And many, many recent polls have shown that increasingly people think of themselves as Taiwanese and not Chinese, rather than, say, 20 years, if you did similar kinds of research, people tended to have dual identifications or cultural identifications. But as someone who directs Institute on Journalism in Taiwan and studied journalism from the Republican era to now, I can say that on one hand, we spend a lot of time documenting the increasing restrictions on what can be said, what can be researched, what can be accessed in the archives, as Professor Beckley had already mentioned, but also we look at it in the context of earlier moments, right, under the KMT, right, or even under the Qing Dynasty, and to think about how modern journalism has to grow up and be in dialogue with these various different kinds of restrictions. In Taiwan's case, under Japanese colonialism, right, and also under soft U.S. colonialism, as it were. So, the sort of complexity of what people say and what states say, right? And how to separate that. And one of the questions that Brenda and Megan had provided us in the beginning was saying, what about working with Chinese professors? Well, one, I should say I am a Chinese professor, but also that because my institute in Taiwan basically hosts people who work on the Republican era, which is 1912 to 1949, a lot of folks who are most, you might imagine, are most engaged with that era, even though it was under the Republic of China, KMT, are scholars from China or from the PRC. And so we have hosted a whole number of Chinese scholars, and it is harder now. I mean, things have dramatically changed, and so it is very hard to do study abroad now between China and Taiwan. But there are still visiting students, but matriculating students are severely limited only to the major provinces. And whereas in the early 2000s, every year saw tens of thousands of PRC students studying in Taiwan. And honestly, I thought they were the most impacted in a positive way from that kind of study exchange than if they had gone to the US. That for a lot of them, and kind of maybe like what Michael was saying about journalists living in Taiwan and Japan and South Korea and whatnot, that being able to study even so-called China topics from the vantage point of a space that is not PRC allowed for a kind of vibrancy of thought. And we recently hosted a kind of alumni reunion online of a lot of these scholars, and some of them have risen quite high. They're deans now or college presidents and whatnot. But I think their time in Taiwan really, really shaped the way they think about doing the kind of work they do. So on one level, I've always been incredibly supportive of exchange, academic exchange, with students and faculty. And I don't think that a kind of trend that has happened, especially in the last, both under Trump, but also during Biden, of kind of restricting or being more suspicious of Chinese scholars in the US is a good thing. I think that this is actually a kind of dangerous precedent, and that to put more suspicion on the kind of exchange is in fact detrimental, because even when things tighten up on a state level, I think human and individual exchange is what really leads to a kind of continued vibrancy. So I was back in China this summer for various conferences, and it was the first time I had been back since COVID, even though I had been in Taiwan several times. And it is absolutely tightened. There are a lot less collaborative work with scholars not in China. A lot of archives are now not open to people who are non-PRC, but even people who are PRC but studying abroad are treated with far greater suspicion. Especially kind of ethnographic or anthropological or data collecting research, since I work with a lot of sociology professors, has become very, very complicated. But it doesn't mean that good work isn't being done there. So when I talked, from a certain Western vantage point, from the US vantage point, you're basically told like, oh God, there's no work to be done. It's all dead. It's all tightened down. But when you're there, you realize, no, there hundreds of thousands of academics who are working diligently doing work, right? And it's not all like writing Xi Jinping praise, right? But how are they doing it? And one of the things that a Chinese author, a friend of mine, Eileen, who often says, he says, working within the Chinese space is learning to 擦边球, which is edge ball or hit a ball right on the line, right? So learning how to do that is part of the idea of doing intellectual, academic, creative work within authoritarian space. And this is something that I want US audiences to really acknowledge and realize, that people are doing this work, even journalists. And it's not all, propaganda. It's actually, but the question is, how do you do it? How do you reconfigure it? what things can you not talk about? And to be honest, as I think everyone here is well aware, the US works exactly the same way as we've seen in the protests in the spring, in the summer, and about to probably begin again in the fall. There are many, many things we cannot talk about in the US with complete impunity. I did want to say that. And the final thing I'll say maybe a little bit about China exceptionalism is I think that's absolutely true. And that was probably gave me most pause. I am a China studies scholar. And one of, I think, the biggest problems within the field, but also within the kind of larger mainstream Chinese cultural soft propaganda, and I don't mean that as state-driven, but just kind of is the whole 5,000年的历史, right? 5,000 years of culture, 5,000 years of relation, that there is a way that it's always that nationalism and factionalism in regimes and multiculturalism is always papered over into a kind of unbroken 5,000-year Chinese civilization as a kind of discourse. And the state very much appropriates that discourse. But I do also want to make that point that China exceptionalism is alive and well when we should always resist it, and not just because I'm from Taiwan, but and to think about regional specificities, regional histories, linguistic specificities, cultural specificities. But I will say the closest thing to China exceptionalism that I always encounter is US exceptionalism. I always hear Americans and US and people who do US politics talk about the US and the rise of US empire as also something that's exceptional and will not fall. And I think that is something that we really could productively have a conversation with. If China exceptionalism is a kind of blind spot, I think US exceptionalism is equally a blind spot and maybe worth discussing in that global context as well, right? So that is just something I want to throw out there. And maybe I'll say one final thing, which is, to circle back to the Tim Waltz study abroad thing. No, he is not a China specialist from, having taught there from 1989 to 1990 and gone back for a few trips. Absolutely not. But I do think that it has led to a very interesting aspect of the way that he talks about China. He's usually quite critical, like many of his caucus when he was in Congress. And he has supported, in some ways, I think probably most famously, he has spoken up for Occupy, Hong Kong protest movements. But I think one thing that is interesting from his earlier time to now, that a lot of that I think living there has given him, is that he really separates what he thinks of as Chinese people with the state. And that is something I appreciate very much. And I think as someone who studies the diaspora, I really feel that one thing we need to learn better to do is to think about state actors versus individuals. And one very, very unfortunate aspect of seeing the increasingly oppressive state apparatus of China is the way that that often bleeds over into anti-Asian hate in the US. And sort of every discussion of Wuhan virus, every discussion of anti-China, Chinese commies, et cetera, ends up becoming a way that people use to discuss Chinese diaspora, Chinese people. And I think that's a real danger. And how do we disaggregate thinking about people versus thinking about, and people within the Chinese space as well, versus how we think about the state? And so maybe I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much both for speaking. It was really great to hear more about your insights. We have one follow-up question that we can begin with. We're going to have a couple of questions on our end, and then we can get into audience Q&A. But you both mentioned the changes from when you yourselves were students and you studied in China versus now. Could you speak to the specific changes that you see and how you think this evolution may have come about? Either one of you could begin.
You want to go first, Eileen, and then maybe I can go after it.
Sure. I feel like this is such an age revealing question. So, because Michael had mentioned that he has studied there in the 2000s and 2010s. So I will say I studied there in the 90s, and lived there and worked there, in Beijing. And I was in a so the thing that, is most marked for me, one is I was there, very much in the years after both incredible 80s liberalism, right? And as well as the brutal crackdown in Tiananmen. And so what did the 90s feel like? I was there in the mid 90s, in China, and it still had a lot of the lingering liberalism of the 80s, and liberalism in a very positive sense. I mean, that there was a lot of art happening, there was a lot of interesting discourse, there were salons, there were talks. People were writing really, but I have a lot of writer and filmmaker friends, and what they all said to me, I also translate Yu Hua, so he's a author of Brothers and To Live and whatnot, and and his point was always that in some ways you can write anything you want, but it's really what gets cracked down is things that become international, like films, but also publishing houses. But writers really, I mean, the kind of stuff that my writer friends still say now shock me. Like, I'm always like, oh gosh, but we learned when we're outside China, you can't even say this, or like people descend upon your apartment and drag you away. But no, people say all sorts of crap. But the understanding is what kinds of venues, when does it become a kind of this is a real China blind spot, like the idea that if you show dirty laundry to the rest of the world, then that's when you get cracked down. But within, there's a lot of kind of domestic critique. And 90s felt like that, even after Tiananmen. And the 2000s, absolutely. And I think this had a lot to do with the economic, sort of growth and freedom. And from a China-Taiwan point of view, there was also a kind of real 90s and 2000s really marked really kind of high point of China-Taiwan exchange. And so as a Taiwan national who was living in China, but with Chinese relatives, you really saw the comfort level there. And then in Shanghai alone in 2000s, when I was doing research there in grad school, there were 200,000 Taiwanese business people, right? Like Taishang business people living in Shanghai. And that number has lessened. And so that kind of human to human exchange was a big part of it. As to Brenda's question of what has really changed, well, certainly since she's ascendance and various other complicated factors that we need not go into here, but it does feel like the most surveilled and most tightly controlled moment that for older people I know say remind them as even more because of technology, more surveilled and more dangerous than the Cultural Revolution era. And that's a pretty big statement, right? But what they mean is that the surveillance now is total. And so but I think this is a global phenomenon, right? I can't say that this is only happening in China. I say globally, we are all being more surveilled. And so that is something that we've really changed, that we really see change. But
yeah, that's very consistent with my impression too. So I was there kind of in the run up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics, and one palpable difference I've noticed is just sort of the overall vibe and vigor. It really felt like China. This was China's coming out party as a great power, and that things were only going to go in a positive direction. And it's just my sense, just hanging out with Chinese friends there, there was incredible optimism and ambition. And it also felt like at no point did it seem like it was going to become some kind of Jeffersonian democracy, but it did sort of feel like, as long as you aren't treading too heavily into sensitive areas, that you can kind of do what you wanted. And there was incredible creativity, all people starting all kinds of interesting businesses that I saw. And there was plenty of criticism of Chinese policy and lots of vibrant discussions. And also just the ability to meet and congregate as groups. I didn't notice really any major blockages to that in sort of the late 2000s when I was really studying intensely there. And I should say is when my first forays into China, a lot of my time there was learning the language. And so I was with a very multinational group. So it's not like we were a bunch of China experts or Chinese Americans going over there. We were very much clearly a foreign group, but we always felt extremely welcome. And I mentioned the ability to congregate. Like, I'll give you one example. I remember we went to a Uyghur restaurant in Beijing, and in the back, there was this big Uyghur, they put on music and other aspects of Uyghur culture. And it was this sort of celebration. And there was a lot of discussion, a frank discussion about the situation that the Uyghurs were facing. I can't imagine anything like that happening in Beijing today. And there's a lot of data bearing this out. People that have studied the Chinese surveillance state have found that the thing the regime really goes after is any semblance of like a civil society developing. Like, there's still, like, if you go on Weibo, there's still plenty of criticism, especially veiled criticism of the regime and people saying all kinds of things. So it's not so much that, it's more about targeting efforts to organize and meet as groups, whether it's in a house church or a group of lawyers or dissidents. And that you definitely feel this sort of atomization of, or at least I do anyway, the atomization of Chinese society in that way, just because of the pervasiveness of this authoritarian surveillance state. And then, I mean, you've probably read, it's not news, but in the media, there's a lot of reporting on the so-called lying flat generation, and just this kind of general sense of malaise in the Chinese population. Now, obviously, in a country as big and diverse as China, you're going to get, a billion different views. But I think there is something to that idea, because I just remember in the 2000s, it really felt like this was sort of China's century. And certainly the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics still remains visually one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, and really reflected that impetus. And now it seems I detect a lot more pessimism just in general from folks that I'm still in contact with there. And I think that has been a major change, in addition to just the sense that your ability to organize has been drastically reduced by the priorities of the regime right now. The last thing I would mention, and I haven't experienced this personally, so I don't want to put too much faith in it, but I've just heard reports that, unlike what I enjoyed in the late 2000s and early 2010s of really feeling welcome as a foreigner around, now I think just because we're perhaps in a moment of greater geopolitical tension and competition and hostility, I've just heard from many of my friends who stayed in China or who stayed in there, then eventually had to leave, that the sense of anti-foreign nationalism has grown dramatically since when we were studying there in the late 2000s. And while it's certainly not pervasive across Chinese society, it's just more prevalent than it was. And it's also, I think that's also just a reflection of the fact there are just a lot fewer foreigners in China. And so when you're there, you stick out a lot more. And, it only takes a few people who, have certain ideas to suddenly make you feel unwelcome. Again, I haven't experienced this personally, but I've heard reports that this is in fact a thing. And you can see it also on the other side, as well as Eileen pointed out.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I do think that's true in the summer when I felt like it is not as foreigner friendly, but I would say that in the US as a sort of Asian body, that I feel like the US is not as Asia friendly now too. So, so there is this kind of, I think it works both ways in a really unnerving way. And so my kid actually just did a gap year in Taiwan and had a great time. And I think that maybe this is something that Michael mentioned earlier too, that one of the weird silver linings is there's this kind of decentering, right? And people discovering possibilities. A lot of my friends who are journalists, I remember Michael Forsyth, New York Times, spoke at my institute a number of years back, and students asked, like, what news do you decide to cover? If you're New York Times, and they're like, to be honest, you're a Washington Post, New York Times journalist. What you want is what gets on the front page. You want your article to get on the front page. And the way you get on the front page is mentioning China. And that's why you're not going to see Taiwan news, right? BC is being asked by young Taiwan journalists. But you see that in the last several years, because the bureaus have all relocated, that is not actually always true. And that's kind of lovely, right? That, in a suddenly there is this slightly more expansiveness in covering Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, because Beijing as a kind of journalistic space has been decentered. And so that's that's one of the weird, and then also study abroad, like that, what Michael was describing, like I feel like China had such great, like I knew so many people who had studied at Beishida or Beida or Fudan, or and all those have now kind of, except for NYU, Shanghai, and DKU, there are very few really China exchange programs that are vibrant, whereas they've all moved to Taiwan. Now, what does that mean for the next generation of academics and policymakers? That is interesting too.
Great. Thank you both so much for your insightful remarks. Another question that I had was kind of regarding branch campuses in China, which is something that has been kind of a big topic of discussion recently. I know Duke Kunshan University is an example of this, and there have been a lot of critiques of these satellite campuses, but there are also a lot of benefits for students. And I was wondering if either of you or both of you can speak more to what branch campuses are, how they operate, and how they're viewed within the wider political landscape.
Eileen, I think you would know a lot more about this than I would. I haven't run an institute. I haven't participated in a branch campus, so I've only watched them from afar. So I'll certainly let Eileen go first.
Well, DKU is a really interesting case study, right? So, actually this summer, because DKU is going through a renewal, so there's been a lot of conversation happening on this right now. I will first off say that because of COVID, one of the things that happened was a lot of international students, so meaning not Chinese students, who were enrolled at DKU could not go back to China during COVID. And then a lot of Chinese nationals who were enrolled at DKU were stuck there and could not come to Duke for an exchange program. So we had students at Duke who were like, have been at Duke who were 3 years of their DKU time. But I would say without question, DKU students are amazing. Like I've had such no offense to Megan, but like wow, DKU students are just I think they elevate the classroom conversation, and they are amazing. And they are very much how I feel that what international education is about, right? That when you have people from not just US, China, but a kind of global cosmopolitan space, you create new possibilities for conversation that do not occur when people do not travel. I know Brenda's dialing in from Mexico right now, right? So, but like so when people have this kind of cross-pollination, and so theoretically, I think these satellite campuses are great. But the thing is, are they really operating in a kind of Republican era extraterritorial space? Like, I mean, can you really do things on these campuses that we promise US university students that they can do on campuses? Of course, this is kind of fraught given the past spring's protests, but are we saying that you can operate US higher ed notions of freedom of speech that don't have to conform to municipal or provincial or Chinese national rulings? This is a point of tension. And so a great question of how is it going to go forward if we see the trend of increasing surveillance and tightening of like Michael was saying about possibilities of organization or civil society, sprouts of civil society. So then what is possible on these campuses? That I do feel a little dark about. I don't know.
Thank you for speaking to that. I think we're going to get started with the audience Q&A now, as we have a question in chat already. So I will go ahead and read it out loud so that everybody else can hear it. Thanks to Eileen and Michael for your time and expertise today. I personally agree that having educational exchanges, US students to Taiwan, China, and vice versa, is crucial to maintain that important human-to-human cultural understanding. In recent times, US-Taiwan exchange has been prioritized for a multitude of reasons. There is also generally declining interest in US-China study abroad exchange. How crucial do you both think it is to reinvigorate US-China educational and cultural exchanges? Any strategies in mind to increase that interest?
I think it's difficult because a lot of this is demand driven. So I think it wasn't just people promoting US-China ties that led to that big surge of American students going over to China, and vice versa. A lot of it is, when China's growing at 10% a year and it seems to be becoming this new emerging power and is just making its influence felt around the world, that's going to generate tremendous demand for people to learn much more about China. I just think there's no way to replace that. And at the same time, feeling like if you're going to go over there and study, that you'll be safe, that you'll be able to be a student or a researcher in the same way you would be in the United States, that makes it just much more attractive. And so in the absence of that, at a time of rising geopolitical tension, at a time of economic troubles, it's hard for those of us that do want to see these kind of ties sustained to keep them going when there's so much demand pressure pushing the other way. I thought what was actually really instructive, I was reading this interview with Nicholas Burns, who's the current US ambassador to China, and he's been a longtime advocate of, we need student exchanges, we need cultural exchanges, we need to have open channels of communication, we need military, in particular, channels of communication so we don't all start shooting at each other. And he just gave this interview, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, where he seemed exasperated because despite his efforts, it was so hard. Not only was there less demand from the American side, but there was increasing, it seemed almost stonewalling from the Chinese side. And he gave these examples of literally Chinese officials pulling the plug on certain exchange groups that he was trying to bring in, et cetera. And so, I think this is what happens when great powers enter into periods of conflict with each other. It has knockdown effects on society, and so it's very hard for those of us that are trying to keep these things going to be able to do so, other than just sort of bemoaning the lack of these kind of exchanges. But I've just seen from my own students a big shift in their priorities, and those, in some ways, it's redounding to the benefit of other countries in East Asia who I think were neglected, including extremely large countries like, I don't know, Indonesia, that are now getting a lot more attention, just because people are turning a bit sour on at least where this current regime is taking China.
Yeah, I mean, so I teach in an Asia Middle Eastern Studies department. So there's always a lot of internal joking about how we're viewed as this kind of slightly sus department, but of various conflict regions. But I do think that there is no substitute for studying abroad and also for learning languages, and whether it be a kind of ChatGPT response or language learning is in decline, right? But yet I feel like, and I think Michael had just said he invested time and energy into studying Chinese, just like I studied English, right, as a teenager, and there is no substitute for that kind of effort and that kind of attention and that kind of cultural immersion. And so whatever we can do to increase that, I do think that as Michael was saying, that the Chinese state is actually very increasingly nervous about it. And so a lot of programs have been cut, including Duke in China, right? And so a lot of these organized groups have minimized, and as I said, like Taiwan has stood to advantage and gained a lot of students as a result. And it will be interesting to see, but there's been a reversal this summer. So obviously people high up realize that they have to change policy to allow more foreign students to come into China. But whether that's going to stick or not, is really up, still kind of up to debate. I will say one thing, as someone who teaches pop culture and, I've written books about pop culture, is that China has always not had great soft power, which is really interesting given how much great literature and film and whatever, philosophy, because I teach also Japanese, I teach anime, you see that so many people who come into these languages or now into Korean are because they are interested in cultural products, right? But China has never kind of cultivated, and Confucius Institute was not, I would say, a success, but cultivated this way that people want to learn the language because they like K-pop, or because they like manga, or there isn't this kind of Chinese connective tissue for a lot of younger people. And and with the economy in decline, then the whole like going to do business, so you have to learn Chinese aspect has also declined. So.
Thank you again for your insights. We had another audience member ask, do you believe that academia can serve as a bridge for improving US-China relations?
I'll lead off because I'm a pessimist, and then Eileen can make me more of an optimist. So I think we're more at the mercy of deeper structural forces that are driving the United States and China apart right now. And so unfortunately, I think in the near term, we're in for a bit of a bumpy ride, and no amount of, me saying, hey, we need to have understanding and talks is going to change that. And I actually think the fundamental problem with the United States and China, with the governments, with their geopolitical positions, is they actually understand each other quite well, and they hate what they see for understandable reasons, and that it's just a straight up conflict of interest over critical territorial, economic, and security related issues. And so that doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It doesn't mean there's a war inevitable. It just means that a period of tension is probably going to be inevitable. Now, within that, academics can still, try to sponsor. We've done a number of these so-called track 2 dialogues where we have either recent officials from both sides meeting to kind of talk behind closed doors in frank discussions. And those still continue. I do have to say that there's a lot fewer of them now, and there's a feeling on the American side that the positions that are coming out of China are just, you already sort of know what they're going to say. And I'm sure the Chinese are saying the same thing about the Americans, again, because it's probably just a conflict of interest between the two sides. So I don't, those things still exist, but is that going to be enough to actually bridge this divide? I'm extremely skeptical. And again, my study of history makes me even more skeptical. I mean, this is actually sort of the norm in world politics, where you have two, what political scientists call enduring rivals, these kind of great power rivalries. These things tend to go on for about 50 years on average. And they really only end when there's a big shift in the balance of power, such that at least one side can no longer really compete at the same level and basically has to drastically scale back its demands of the other side. So like the Soviet Union, eventually just runs out of gas, and Gorbachev has to, sell out to the West. That's the kind of best case scenario, I think, for some kind of winding down of this tension. I just don't see student exchanges or track 2 dialogues really being able to do a whole lot to bridge the divide. But I would love to be corrected on this.
No. I do think we are in a pessimistic moment. But I guess I will say in a kind of optimistic way that being situated as US academics, maybe what we can do is as much as we can to support Chinese counterparts, right? So, you're not going to influence state policy or structural, as the 50-year enduring rival was a little bit of a dampening thought, but to the extent that, so my little institute in Taiwan, or what I can do at Duke, is to say, I still want to do as much as I can to welcome Chinese students, Chinese academics, Chinese scholars to have the freedom to do the kind of work they can do, to support as much as I can financially, by giving scholarships, or by issuing invitations. But this is a very, very small scale thing to do. But it's better than doing nothing. I also feel like one should push back against a kind of inherent xenophobia, or within the US, such as, Texas and Florida, weighing legislation to not let foreign nationals own real estate. Or the incredibly difficult process of getting work visas for academics of foreign descent. These are all things that then, as an American citizen, I could campaign for or fight for, right? That I think that to call out xenophobia. A third, and maybe weirdly optimistic thing to say, is, of course, if you think about the Chinese Revolution, the Revolution 1911, 1912, is, of course, to think the role that overseas Chinese and Chinese diaspora played, right? Sun Yat-sen himself, overseas Chinese, is that sometimes the people who care most are part of the diaspora, and to not kind of broad brush them as or be suspicious of them as somehow tied to China or foreign interests, but rather see that sometimes the people most critically engaged and with the highest stakes for better US-China relations are people caught in the middle. And so I do a lot of, I don't know if Megan and I had discussed this, I do a lot of Chinese language podcasting. But a lot of the people I talk to and work with are people who are deeply engaged with Chinese topics, right? And they want to speak to this larger global diaspora of Chinese. And it's not actually anti-China. This is a big, important distinction, right? There are people who are critical and concerned about China, and therefore maybe for necessity live abroad, but they care deeply about what happens to China. So
Thank you both for speaking to that and giving us a little bit more insight into that. Another question that we have from an audience member is, what do you think is the best way to change how U.S. politicians and federal agencies that implement the U.S.-China policy from interpreting China in a non-threatening viewpoint? And we also received another similar question asking a little bit more about how your work may engage with U.S.-China policies. And yeah, that intersection. This question may be a little bit more geared towards Professor Beckley, since you have more experience with foreign policy and political science. But
I think part of it is accurately describing where China actually poses a threat to certain U.S. interests and where it doesn't. So a lot of my research was trying to show where, like, for example, there's a lot of fear over Chinese espionage. And I think, as Eileen as Professor Chow has pointed out, this can redound into these broad sweeping measures to either limit the ability of Chinese nationals to come here or study here, to work here, and can also just spur anti-Asian hate more broadly, even among Chinese Americans or Asian Americans. And so I think accurately saying, well, okay, is it true that China is about to somehow pilfer American semiconductor technology and it's going to flip overnight, and that's suddenly going to cause a massive shift in the balance of power in China's favor and devastate U.S. security? If you actually look at the evidence, it's probably not going to happen that way. And so there's a very low likelihood of that threat really becoming acute. And so that then can reassure policymakers that, hey, actually the bigger risk is coming in with a giant sledgehammer and undermining what are actually fruitful links, not just from just sort of a humanitarian perspective, but actually from a U.S. interest perspective. The United States gains tremendously from its international scientific exchanges. So a lot of it is just accurately measuring and characterizing areas where China does or does not pose a critical security threat, and then trying to go in with a scalpel to do highly specific background research on very particular individuals in very particular industries that could potentially pose a threat, while whitelisting the vast majority of other folks that are trying to come and study here. I mean, this sounds very straightforward, but it can easily get lost up if there's momentum within the bureaucracy that just says, it's not even worth the risk, because we're at such a fine point in the balance of power that any advantage that flows to the other side could be devastating for us. So it's better to err on the side of caution and just blanket, ban. I think a more nuanced perspective, and maybe this is an area where academics who are willing to nerd out and really do the due diligence here can help spread the word, and therefore allow for much more tailored policy solutions. Because you do have to protect certain things. I don't think anyone would argue against that. It's just, it seems like it's really spiraling into these sort of just blanket, tech bans on China, student bans, and making it much harder for Chinese nationals to come work here. And then that just spreads a societal perception that people that may look like they're from China are somehow under suspicion.
yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Great. Thank you for your answer for that question. Thank you to the audience as well for all of your questions. We are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you to Professors Michael Beckley and Eileen Chow for being with us for this webinar today. We greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your perspectives. Thank you also to all of those who have attended. We value your support and engagement. We would also like to give special thanks to USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. They are Sands, AIG, FedEx, ConocoPhillips, Phillips Morris International, Fairfield Maxwell, Suntory, and Walmart.
Although we are out of time, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with our speakers, please reach out to us and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the things we've discussed today. Thank you again for joining, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.